and welcome to Myth Monsters. My name is Erin and I'll be your host for these little snack bite-sized podcasts on folklore and mythical monsters from around the world. These podcasts focus on the actual cryptids, folklore and mythic monsters from global mythology, rather than focusing on the full stories of heroes and their big adventures. I'll also be dropping in some references that they have to recent culture and where you can see these represented in modern day content so that you can learn more and get as obsessed as I am about these absolute legends of the mythological world. Spring is well and truly here. It's been a beautiful week here in the UK with the sun shining, and I certainly hope you're getting the springtime vibes now too, although I can't say that this week's monster is particularly linked to that. I'm making a very typical British weather conversation, okay? Just want to say a big thank you to everyone who got in touch last week after my sad news. I really appreciate the love and support, and typically, of course, I've had even more bad luck this week and managed to cut off the top of one of my fingers and give myself an intestinal infection, which I'm currently still battling, hence the lateness of this one too. So the weather has been a very literal hopeful light this week. But anyway, enough about that. For this week's monster, we're heading somewhere super warm and going over to West Africa and the Caribbean for a legendary monster/god, depending on what stories you follow of him, I suppose, the epic spider storyteller Anansi. Anansi is typically described as either a small spider or sometimes a typical man. His form kind of depends on the story that he's telling or starring in, but in his spider form he usually has a human element to him, such as his head, or even sometimes his full human torso on a spider body. Nightmare fuel, in all honesty. In his human form though, he typically has some form of a spider nod, such as having spidery legs coming out of his sides or his shoulders, or even within his hair. He's usually spotted wearing a bag, which he carries all of his wisdom within, but you'd be lucky to find him in general due to his size. In his normal human form, he is generally a shorter man. However, in spider form, he is the same size as an average tarantula. So I guess you'd have to look out for a tarantula with a bag on, or potentially a person's head, which I think would be pretty easy in a spider lineup. Anansi is typically described as a trickster, and sometimes even as a god. Much like Loki, who we all know from Norse mythology, Anansi's greatest power is trickery, intelligence and deception, but he's also the god of storytelling. Both kind of sit in hand with each other as well. He's very good at telling stories to influence and manipulate, which can make him both a good and a bad guy, depending on what mood you get him in. He's also known as the Keeper of Knowledge, and is often considered too as a god of wisdom. He's obtained this title through using those manipulations, wit and negotiation skills to outwit people like kings, gods and monsters alike. Like some of his fellow Caribbean gods, he's also very fond of a deal, and using bargaining to get what he wants, sometimes at the expense of others. As well as this, he does have some general powers, such as shape-shifting between his human and spider forms, and being able to change the size of himself in those forms to either slink away unnoticed or intimidate others by being a massive spider, I guess. When he is a spider, he's also able to weave webs, and depending on what size he is, they can trap whatever size prey. Whilst he doesn't tend to eat the people trapped in them, he can mentally also weave a web with his stories, or ensnare their destinies, thoughts and fates. Speaking of all things mystical, it's also said that he has control over the flow of time within his stories, and he is able to control the course of events and make things unfold in the way that he wants them to, rather than how they are supposed to be. Because of this, he's also able to control the environment within these two, such as controlling the weather or influencing animals, which he can also communicate with and control. So he is quite a powerful guy. If he is indeed a god, which is debated, he is also immortal, But it's also thought that maybe he's just very good at getting away from potential death and always finds a way to come back. In terms of generally his eating, he eats like a normal bloke and a normal spider. He dabbles in both menus. Gross. He's also not alone. He has a family, which never happens in our monster tales. He has a supposed long-suffering wife, Okinoriya, and 4 children, 3 sons and a beautiful daughter. I will not attempt to pronounce their names because they are very complex and I don't want to butcher them, but there are a couple of stories about Anansi's children in folklore too that you can find. And sometimes they star in his ones too. Now, on to etymology. The word Anansi is from the Akan language, which is from Ghana in Africa, and it very literally translates into spider. He does have some other names though, such as Kwaku Anansi, Nansi, Anansi, Aunt Nancy, or Sis Nancy, but all of them really translate into the same thing. Anansi equals spider. Now his history is unfortunately quite hazy. We know he comes from West Africa, specifically from Ghana, but much like many folklore creatures, we don't have a time span on when they came into being. This is usually because these stories were spread through word of mouth, and writing down this kind of thing just didn't happen, let alone thinking of preserving them until modern day, which Ghana also did not have historically the facilities to do so. But what we do know about Anansi has been carried through the years through word of mouth from Ghana and the rest of West Africa. But because of the slave trade, many Africans were taken to the US and the Caribbean, and Anansi also became a part of their history and folklore too, with some minor geographical adaptations. This is why this monster is considered an African Caribbean monster, because it traversed the seas with the slaves who brought this to new nations and cherished it as a celebration of the old world that they were stolen from. And of course, because of all of this, the earliest texts that we have on Anansi are from the 1900s, when William Barker, an American missionary, collected stories from slaves in 1917 for his book West African Folktales. This was followed by the British anthropologist Robert Rattray in the 1930s, who travelled to Ghana and listened to stories directly from the Akan Ashanti people. But of course, we believe that Anansi has been around for much longer than this. I do want to tell you some of the stories about Anansi that make him so famous though. Because I don't have those dates and we don't have anything specific, in terms of history, that's about it. But the stories really do tell themselves. They're great. These are known as Anansi stories, or spider tales, and there's actually a story as to why that is, so we'll kick off with that one. This one is called How the Sky God Stories Came to be Known as Spider Stories. Anansi wanted to own stories generally as a thing. He's very intelligent, he wanted them. So he went to the sky god Nyame, who said he could have them if he could capture 4 creatures for him. A python, a swarm of hornets, a leopard, and a fairy. Anansi agreed, and actually threw in his mum as part of the deal, and went off to get the creatures. He approached the python first, and tricked him into comparing his length to a tree branch, and whilst he was distracted, Anansi strangled him with webbing. Next, the hornets, he threw water at them which made them think it was raining, and they flew into the nearest shelter, which typically ended up being a carved out gourd that Anansi was holding, which he then sealed up with hot wax. The leopard was probably the most simple. He dug out a pit outside of the leopard's lair, and once the leopard fell in, he offered to help to pull it up. But as he did, he stabbed him in the head instead. And lastly, with the fairy, he carves a doll called an Akua child and lathers it in tree sap. And of course, fairies are attracted to taking children. And as it attempted to take the idol, she is stuck in the sap, and Anansi takes her to the sky god. The sky god's very happy, and as a reward, he not only gives Anansi his stories, but the complete power and ownership of them as a god, making them now spider stories, which is what they are now known as across the West African folklore. One of these spider stories is how wisdom came into the world, and in this one, Anansi is seen as a godly figure, and the human race had done something, we don't know exactly what, it doesn't say, to offend Anansi. He decides to punish them by gathering all of the wisdom that he had shared with them, and he sealed it in a bag. He then tied the bag around his neck and went into the jungle to hide it in a tree. However, halfway up the tree, he realised that he was really struggling because the bag kept swinging in the way of his climbing. His son, who had followed him, then approached, who'd been watching his dad struggle for a while, as you should always do, and suggested that Anansi put the bag on his back instead, so that it didn't get in the way of his climbing. Anansi realised in that moment that all of his wisdom was definitely in that bag, and even his son had more than him right now. So in anger, he threw the bag to the floor, and his wisdom shot out, spreading across the world for mankind to use. I think it's a hilarious story about how dads are super stubborn, and I think I can definitely see my dad doing exactly this. And I too would watch him struggle for a good hour before helping him. Now, there are plenty more spider stories. I won't read them all out to you, but there's a taste of just the two of them. But there are recorded to be up to 100 spider stories out there. So if I've piqued your interest, I've popped some book recommendations on later as to where you can read more. Spiders are obviously very linked to storytelling within folklore, but also in general. We've all heard the phrase web of lies, or you've been caught in someone's web of deceit, and these sayings come from the idea of folklore spiders, weaving deception and manipulation. Spiders are typically small but mighty, and they truly represent the tongue being mightier than the sword, and Anansi is no different. There is no record of him ever being physically violent with his body, he was just very, very good at words. Anansi is a beloved and legendary monster, and he's immensely popular within modern media. There is even an Anansi festival which was set up to celebrate Caribbean children's roots in Africa when their ancestors were displaced by slavery. This has been running since 2007 all over the world and celebrates art, song, dance, book readings and stories around these ancestral links all coming together. Now, there is a technical, direct mythology comparison this week, which is, and you might know it from Disney's Song of the South, Brer Rabbit, who is an African-American folklore critter. This trickster figure was directly inspired by Anansi, although in one of the spider stories he does meet a trickster rabbit called Aswante Tiwi, which he might also take inspiration from. And also it's really common throughout West African mythology that rabbits can be tricksters, and to approach a hare would be to ask for trouble, basically. The Brer Rabbit is suggested by scholars to also represent these enslaved Africans in America and the Caribbean who use their wits to get their own back on their owners, and sometimes their revenge too, making him and Anansi in turn kind of folk heroes. The mystical spider is also used in other folk tales across the world, such as the spider grandmother and the Iktomi from Native American folklore, the former offering guidance and protection, and the latter being a trickster, much like Anansi. And we also have the stereotypical spider monsters, which are the Juragomo and the Sushigomo from Japanese folklore, both of which are just terrifying monsters who shape-shift into spiders and just really love to eat people. So they don't directly relate to Anansi, but they are ones who can shape-shift in and out of spider form if you're looking for something a bit more Japanese, but also a bit more violent. Now, moving on to modern media, there is a hefty bit for this monster surprisingly, and I was really surprised by this. So I've included everything and not added any filler bits in here this week. This is all about Anansi. For art, unfortunately, this is the exception. There's not much here, I'm afraid. All I can recommend is the illustration of Anansi by Pamela Coleman Smith from 1899, or you can have a look at the Anansi puppet from the Puerto Rican puppeteer Terry Marical, which was used in a TV show back in the late 80s called La Casa de Maria Shusima. Otherwise, there are some really cool independent illustrations around this monster, so do have a look around. In movies, we have a couple: Anansi Turns Over a New Leaf, Anansi's Healthy Diet, Kuiku Anansi, and Anansi the Spider. For TV, we have Anansi Boys, which is due to come out, Anansi, Gargoyles, We All Have Tails, Static Shock, Sesame Street, Anansi the Spider, La Casa de Maria Shuzima, American Gods, Wishbone, Legend Quest, Superstition, and Miraculous Tales of Ladybug and Cat Noir. In video games, we have ones such as Spider-Man Unlimited, Pandora's Box, Civilization 6, Shivers, Persona Ascended, Shin Megami Tensei, Kuaku Anansi, MechWarrior Online, and MechWarrior 5 Mercenaries. There is also a card game called Anansi, which won a bunch of awards, so if you're into board games, card games, check that out too. A really worthy shout out is that Anansi is also a Marvel superhero, supposedly the first ever Spider-Man. And I also have to shout out the legendary Britpunk band Skunk Anansi, who I knew their name from, who are just absolutely iconic within British music culture, and actually got their name from the monster himself, but decided to make it more metal by adding the skunk in it as well. Now, my book recommendations this week are African and Caribbean Folktales, Myths and Legends by Wendy Schreier for all things in these mythologies. Or, for Anansi himself, have a look at Anansi the Trickster Spider by Lingana, or Anansi New and Ancient African Tales, and this is by various authors, but if you search the book title, this will come up. If you have kiddos, there are also a few kids' books specifically to Anansi. So there's Anansi and the Golden Pot by Taya Selassie and Taniku Fagboron, Anansi and the Rabbit, the Moss-Covered Rock Story by Al Campbell, or Anansi the Clever Spider by Susie Lynn. These are all beautifully illustrated and made for children, so they're a perfect one if you're trying to get them into West African folklore. But now it's time for Do I Think They Existed? It's a tricky one this week because, again, it kind of tiptoes around God territory, and I would never want to declare that a God exists or doesn't. That truly depends on what you believe as an individual in my eyes. It is not down to me to spread what I think about a belief in any system. But for this monster / God, I will take him out of the God context for now. Honestly, I think something like Anansi could exist within our universe. We've all seen Charlotte's Web, haven't we? While spiders are gross and have far too many eyes and legs, the fascination with them is something that humans have had for such a long time, and the link to weaving webs and spinning manipulations and stories is perfect for this kind of monster. The only thing stopping me from full-on saying sure in this one is that he can shapeshift back and forth, which is something that we don't typically see within our universe. However, it's maybe just something we've not been able to prove yet, I guess. I didn't know very much about Anansi before this. I've heard his name in passing, and Skunk Anansi is big responsible for that, and I understand so much now why he has a following, and the respect that he does. I truly believe he is a folk hero, and so important as a grounding point for those who were stolen from their homes and forced to make communities in a new place, but thankfully with people who shared the same views on him, grew up in the same place. And I think that kind of web is the best kind. It's the ones that bind us together as humans, and I think that is so important. But what do you think? Did Anansi cause mischief and spread stories across Africa, the US and the Caribbean? Let me know on social media. I would love to know what you think about this one. I really enjoyed covering this one, and I have to say that almost all of this year's monsters were suggested from you guys, my lovely listeners. This one was from Rabina Hannah on Twitter. I'm sorry if I've pronounced that wrong. And I couldn't find the recommendation from last week till after the point, but the Rakurakubi was sent in by Sam Gluckman on Spotify comments. Thank you so much, both of you, for sending some really great suggestions. I love covering recommended monsters, so please do keep sending them through. My only caveat to this is if there's not enough info about them, if I can't find more than a page anywhere, I'm going to really struggle to fill 15 minutes, let alone anything else with them. So do keep that in mind, and please don't be upset if I don't cover them because of that. But if you do ping them through, I will make sure to shout you out if I can find the recommendation. So please do keep them coming. Next week though, we're heading over to ancient Greece and Rome for the first time this year, and we are looking at a fan favourite, the lovely ladies of nature, the Dryads. Come and bring your best gardening set next Thursday for these gorgeous woodland spirits. For now though, thank you so much for listening. It's been an absolute pleasure. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give it a rating on the service you are listening on. I've got loads of social media for any questions or suggestions on what monsters to cover next, and I'd really love to hear from you. The social media handles for TikTok, YouTube and Instagram are Myth Monsters Podcast. The Twitter is Myth Monsters Pod, but I'm trying to get away from that on Blue Sky under Myth Monsters, and all of our content can be found at mythmonsters.co.uk, and you can find us on Good Pods, Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon if you want to help me fund the podcast too. Come join the fun though, share this with your pals, they might love me as much as you do. But for now, stay spooky, and I'll see you later, babes.